Hitler went into Poland and Stalin went into Poland, and still millions of Americans said, that's not our fight. And then that fight got bigger, and millions of Americans said, that's not our problem. And then tragically, it became our problem on December 7th in 1941. And I think, echoing historians and Kagan in particular, had we thought we had dogs in those fights and we were more engaged from the beginning, we might have avoided the tragedy that was World War II.
Why should ordinary Americans care? I mean, let me play devil's advocate for a moment. A lot of Americans are just struggling to pay their food bills. We definitely have a massive affordability crisis. So why should some, struggling family in the middle of Kansas, frankly, care other than, for sentimental reasons, if Putin swallows Ukraine? Or frankly, if China moves against Taiwan, or if, the World Bank and, USAID is gone, but if it had survived or failed, if the UN survives or remains in the United States on American soil, what the heck does it matter to Americans who are, struggling just to pay their bills and, hold things together?
So thanks, Larry. That's the fundamental question. So I'm glad we're starting with it. Because if you go back to the 30s, when there was a lot of hardship in America, a lot more than is today, millions and millions of Americans were saying exactly the arguments that you are making, right?
Not our fight.
Not our fight. Ethiopia, where is that? I don't even know where that is. That's the Italians, right? Japanese went in into China, and people said, why do we care? That's not, we have no dog in that fight. And then more amazingly to me, Hitler went into Poland and Stalin went into Poland, and still millions of Americans said, that's not our fight. And then that fight got bigger, and millions of Americans said, that's not our problem. And then tragically, it became our problem on December 7th in 1941. And I think, echoing historians and Kagan in particular, had we thought we had dogs in those fights and we were more engaged from the beginning, we might have avoided the tragedy that was World War II. So that's where I start. Second thing, think about everybody listening. There's some squirrely cases and some vague cases here. We can talk about the War of 1812 if you want. But if you think about it, every enemy of the United States has been a dictatorship over the course of all of our history. Now, we've had some monarchies and autocracies that have been our allies, including the French going all the way back to the beginning of our republic. Of course, we've done that. We have some autocracies that are friendly to the United States today. That's true. But all of our enemies have been dictatorships. Some in our field, as you know, Larry, argued, well, it's the rise of great powers. That's the whole thing. And it doesn't really matter what's inside. I just disagree with that. That's a misreading of global history. Germany is way more powerful today than they were in 1945. I'm not worried about going to war with them. Same with the Japanese. But why am I worried about China? Because they're an autocracy and they don't share our values. Russia, when it was more democratic, was not as threat as Putin's dictatorship is. So that part, you can ignore it, but ignore it at your peril. And then the last thing I will say, and I can go deeper in this, but we're better off stopping these threats over there so that we don't get dragged in to wars if, God forbid, they should attack our allies and partners.
Hi, I'm Pat Morrison, one of the hosts of America at a Crossroads. If you like this video, don't just watch. Head over to our website where you can subscribe for early access to new programs, see our upcoming schedules, and connect directly with our guests in our weekly live streams. Thank you for watching.
So let's start with Ukraine. I want to help the Ukrainians to do all they can to stop the Russian army in eastern Ukraine so that we don't, 2 to 3 or 4 or 5 years from now, get dragged into a war when Russia after their victory in Ukraine, attacks Lithuania. And that is not.
Explain that, Mike, why Lithuania's NATO membership would trigger that.
Right, because they're a member of NATO. Article 5 commitment says an attack on one is attack on all. And their ability to fight the Russian army is much more constrained than the Ukrainian army is now. So you don't even have to care about values. You could just care about security. Why is it's much more rational for us to support Ukrainian warriors who, by the way, they don't want our soldiers. They don't want American soldiers. All they want is the means to defend their country. That, to me, seems like a really good bet so that we don't have to fight the Russian army if they get so powerful after their win in Ukraine that they decide to march on. And study that part of the world, and you will know that that has happened time and time again with Nazi Germany and with Stalin's Soviet Union. They march until they can't march any further. The same thing in Asia. And again, Larry, you're the expert, not me, but I want to avoid a war with China over the island of Taiwan. I think that is a paramount national security interest that all Americans should embrace. And the way to avoid war over Taiwan is to deter war. And that means us giving more military assistance to the government of Taiwan and to help them get more prepared. Again, Larry, you're the expert, so I feel you should jump in. You're the expert, I'm not. But the things that the prime minister in Japan said recently that everybody's apoplectic about, I celebrate that. And I'm disappointed that President Trump is not supporting her because I think deterrence works. And if we begin to get wobbly, that's when bad things happen. And I'm with Ronald Reagan on this. Peace through strength. Keep strong, keep deterrence, keep our allies close. I'm deeply, deeply disappointed by the damage we're doing to our allies, especially in NATO, especially in Europe and Canada. We'll come back to that later. Because for a simple reason that if our allies are strong, that helps us deter China and Russia. But if we begin to look wobbly, that is tempting for Putin. That is tempting to Xi Jinping. And that's when we could get dragged into a war that I think could be avoided.
Next week, it's going to be the former U.S. ambassador to Russia and Stanford professor of political science, former Ambassador Michael McFaul, in conversation with Larry Diamond, who's also been at Stanford. Autocrats versus Democrats is his book, The New Global Disorder. That's going to be a great program next week. Be sure to check it out and then have a couple of weeks of rest, and we'll be back in January. Thanks again for being with us today.